Long time no see, everybody. Welcome in to GC Live. Kendall Smith here, and they threw me up on the big screen. We've got Wes Mitchell, Chris Clark, and Jack Veltri joining us as well. There they are. Hello, everybody. I haven't seen you guys in so long. It's so good to be back. How we doing?
We're good, Kendall. And Kendall doesn't know what we're going to talk about today. We just said, Kendall, we're going live. We're going to talk about whatever you want to talk about. So you're going to throw the questions at us, and we're going to give everybody final thoughts on South Carolina's season. Not ODU, big picture predictions on Gamecock football. Of course, as always, we know it, brought to you by our buddy Clint Hammond and ClintHammond.com.
Wes, I have to say it was kind of crazy for you to put me up there by myself to start off the show. There he did it again. I'm back. It's like I never left. It is so good to be back and so exciting to talk about South Carolina football. The time is nearing. It is drawing closer. The moment we have all been waiting for. It is game day eve. So game day officially tomorrow. And like you said, Wes, not necessarily talking about tomorrow's game as much as we are talking about this season as a whole. So want to start it off on a little bit more of a broad way and then kind of get into the details as we continue with this show. But to start it off, question for all three of you, and we'll start this one off with Chris Clark. What are you most looking forward to this season, Chris?
Well, I think you got to go with Lenora Sellers, right? Like I think that's what what everybody around South Carolina wants to see. There are a bunch of players individually I think that everybody wants to see. But when you combine the new backfield of Lenora Sellers, Rocket Sanders, I think that's what has Gamecock fans most excited, right? The quarterback is always a position that folks are really dialed into. Then you look at South Carolina, which finished last in the SEC in rushing in 2023. It's an area where they got to get a lot better, and fans are really looking forward to seeing whether or not South Carolina can get better. So you bring in Rocket Sanders from the portal, former 1,400-yard rusher. You add in Lenora Sellers, who's a super talented, a young but super talented quarterback. I think that backfield battery of Sellers and Sanders, really looking forward to seeing what they can do this season.
Wes, you have been excited about Lenora Sellers for years now. You started the Lenoris hype train. So we'll throw this one to you. What are you most excited about with the Gamecocks for this upcoming season?
You like to give me credit for that. I don't know if I actually
He kind of started it, I have to say. Like, I remember a few years back, he's like, there's this guy, his name is Lenora Sellers, and he is going to be amazing for South Carolina. Mark my words. And we have marked the words, Wes. So
if you'll give it to me, I will take it. Don't worry about that. But yeah, Kendall, so since Chris did say Lenoris, I'll go kind of related, but big picture, like a similar thing. I'm curious to see what this offense looks like in general. Like, what does the scheme look like? How do they take all these new players? Obviously, we know Lenoris has taken over for Spencer Rattler, but Rocket Sanders, new wide receivers, new offensive linemen. I mean, it's a completely different group, completely different offense. You bring in Sean Elliott. We'll see what his influence is. You know, even Mike Shula, who comes in as a guy that worked with Cam Newton, worked with Allen in Buffalo. Like, there's a lot of different ways they could take this thing. I don't know if we're going to see the full thing on Saturday. I imagine it will kind of grow as the season goes on. But I'm just very curious to see, how do they structure everything? What's the game plan? Dal Loggins has talked for ever since he got here. I want to build this thing around my quarterback. You got a different quarterback in play this year, so I'm curious to see what that looks like.
All right, Jack, you get the final word on this one. A couple of good answers from Wes and Chris. What do you have to add on?
Yeah, these guys have covered just about everything that you could say good about this offense, right? There's so much to be looking forward to with this offense. Quickly on that subject, just I think the run game this year is such a big thing to look at with this team. You know, that Casey Henry talked about a few weeks ago, South Carolina offensive lineman starting at right tackle tomorrow night. This could be a ground and pound team. And so I'm interested to see if they end up being a run first team, which I definitely think they will be, because there's not a true number one at wide receiver yet, right? I think Shane Beamer and Dal Loggins both have said it's going to be more by committee at receiver this year, though I do think they have enough good receivers to where they can make it work and fill the void left by someone like Xavier Luedecke last year. But the thing for me this year, and I think a lot of games are going to come down to it, is what is this defense going to do, right? They went through that month stretch last year where they couldn't force a turnover. Just nothing was going right in October. And then you get into November and things are really clicking. You switch over the defensive scheme with Clayton White, and things are looking a lot better in that final month. How does that carry over? You have a lot of new faces on that defense. I think the defensive line is one of the best in the SEC this season. And I think you got a lot of veterans in that room to where you can make a lot of noise and win a lot of football games because of your defense. So I think different perspective here compared to the offense. I'm excited about the offense, but I think a lot of games are going to come down to what the defense does this year, and they can win you a lot of ball games.
Some new faces, some returning faces. So let's go ahead and get into some key players, some MVPs of the year. We've talked about this a little bit over on GamecockCentral.com, so definitely be sure to go check out those articles. But let's go ahead and kick it to the offensive side of things. The one key player, who is it for you? Jack, we'll start off with you this time, that you're looking at on the offense that you think can make the biggest impact early on this season.
Yeah, I think offensively, and I said this in the roundtable story, I mean, obviously Lenore Sellers, Rocket Sanders, those are your key guys on offense. But for me, just to be a little different, I did say Jared Brown would be a name that I think is really going to be the focal point in the receiver room. I think if there's anyone that eventually steps up and becomes that quote-unquote true number one receiver, I do think it could be Jared Brown. You've seen what he did at Coastal Carolina with a quarterback like Grayson McCall and how he made that work there. I think with Sellers in his first year as the true starting quarterback for the Gamecocks, I think having a reliable weapon on the outside like a Jared Brown could be very impactful this year. And, there are other names you could say in that receiver room that could be guys that step up, but we haven't really seen any of them truly proven themselves in the past like a Jared Brown has. So that's the thing I'm keeping an eye on that really could be maybe a sleeper MVP for this offense this year.
Wes, I wonder if you're going to go with Lenore Sellers for this one. Who is your impact player on offense as we get ready for this season?
Kendall, I'm going to go against the grain for myself. I think it's got to still be Rocket Sanders. I mean, you could pick a lot of guys. There's several options you could go with, but they brought in Rocket Sanders to be, in my opinion, the focal point of this offense. Jack talked about this being a potentially run-based offense, and for me, you brought him in to be that guy. Now, I think you add in him to the passing game as well. This is a kid who can catch the football too, did a lot of that at Arkansas. If you have a situation where you're not quite sure what your wide receiver group looks like, why not use him in the passing game as well? So I think a big year for Rocket. Don't know if he'll get to 1,000 yards rushing, but I think he'll have a big year both rushing and receiving and probably be the MVP of this offense, Kendall.
Yeah, so many people excited about what Rocket Sanders could do for South Carolina's offense this season. Chris, on to you. Who you got?
I do have Sellers. I think there's some great points by both the guys. And certainly when you look at Rocket Sanders, he might not just be the most proven guy on the offense. He might be the most proven guy on the entire roster based on what he's done at the college level. Does anybody else on the roster have the equivalent of, a 1,400-yard rushing season? Probably not. That said, South Carolina did a pretty good job this offseason flipping that running back room. We all know you need more than one back. There's one ball, and only one player touches it on every play aside from Vershawn Lee at center, and that is Lenore Sellers. So I think, the way that he plays, and he'll need help from his teammates, but ultimately being the quarterback, playing the most important position on the field, rather, he's a guy that this offense is going to go basically where he can take it. That may not be fair in year one, but it's the reality of life in the SEC as a quarterback. So I think when we look back at the end of the year, we're going to say that he brought a ton of value to this offense as the quarterback.
Chris, I'm coming right back to you. We did offense. Let's kick it over to the defensive side of things really quickly for each of you. And like I said, we'll start off with Chris, your impact player on defense for this season.
Probably a popular pick. Debo Williams, though, is who I'm going with. We talked about proven guys. Last season, he was the leading tackler on this team, and he was the leading tackler by a pretty good margin. I think Jalen Kilgore was number 2, but he was 30, 40 tackles away. Debo's kind of the heartbeat of this defense, not just with the way he plays, but his attitude, his disposition, the way that he plays. He kind of lays it out all on the line. Now, he'll have, I think, a little bit more help this season. with guys that can back him up, like a Bengali Kamara, guys playing alongside him. They've got more depth overall in this front six, front seven. But I still think if you're looking at one guy who, man, you really want to have him on the field, you probably got to go with Debo Williams.
All right, Jack, you get to say who you've got next. What are you thinking?
Next, I mean, the real choice here is Debo Williams, so that's who I'm going to ultimately go with too. Basically, what like everything Chris said, this is your heart and soul of the defense. This is the guy that led the team in tackles last year by a pretty wide margin. Great all-around player, and he's definitely going to be someone that if he has another really good year here, we could be talking about middle of the rounds in the NFL draft next year. And I think he's definitely the name to keep an eye on. But I'm also going to say let's not sleep on what this defensive line could do just in general. I'm not going to pick out any player in specific, but I think this entire D-line, especially in a game tomorrow where you're going against Old Dominion's offensive line that gave up 62 sacks last year, returning some of those guys, I expect the D-line to really get a lot of push up front and get that pass rush going, get to the quarterback. I know that's something a lot of those guys and Sterling Lucas and Travion Robertson talked a lot about this offseason was our pass rush needs to be better. We need to not turn these quarterback hits into sacks, and we need to be making plays on that front. So I'm definitely expecting a big year from not just Debo Williams, but that whole defensive line, especially with all the experience they have up front.
Wes, are you going with Nick Eamon-Worry? That's what I need to know. What do we have here?
I am going with Nick Eamon-Worry. I feel like you're reading my mind here, Kendall. So obviously, Debo is a great pick, but man, y'all remember how good Nick was as a freshman, and I feel like we were all sitting there going, if Nick takes a step forward last year, how special could this kid be? And so he was banged up early on. Then they had the little thing where they were moving guys around in the secondary. Who's going to play nickel for a game or two? That was Nick. And then he kind of slid back to safety. I feel like all that's settled now. Like they have the guys in the spots that they want them in. Junior year for Nick. So this is kind of that contract year where you're getting ready to possibly go pro after this year. I think if Eamon-Worry puts it all together, we saw what he is capable of. So to me, he's someone who could maybe emerge and be one of the top safeties in the SEC, and that would put him in line to be a potential MVP for South Carolina.
So last year, I think it is safe to say, obviously, a bit disappointing for a lot of Gamecock fans that were maybe expecting more from the team. But when you look at this year's team in comparison to last year, guys, what's something that you think the team has significantly improved on that fans should be excited about? Jack?
There's a lot of different things you could talk about this team improving, because I think in almost every facet of the game, I feel like they've gotten better, right? Defense, they brought in more experience, more veterans from the transfer portal, and you brought in some of the young guys like Dylan Stewart, obviously the 5-star recruit at edge. That's huge. Offensive line, I think they brought in pieces to replenish that area. But for me, and we'll see how it looks this season, because I'm still, cautiously optimistic about it, but I think it can work, is the run game, right? You were dead last in the SEC last year, averaging roughly 85 yards per game on the ground. You bring in Rocket Sanders, you bring in Oscar Attaway, you bring in Jawarn Howell, you got DJ Braswell come back, you have Juju McDowell, obviously, and then you have Matthew Fuller, the freshman. So you have a lot of depth and potential talent that could create a good run dynamic for this team. But you also have a running quarterback in Lenore Sellers, and even Robbie Ashford if you need him in some sort of short yardage packages. You have guys that can really go out there and get those extra yards. And the run game was such an issue last year to where Spencer Rattler had to throw the ball a ton last year. And if Xavier Legette wasn't open, if he was being double covered, this receiver core had a tough time making plays. So I think it all starts with what South Carolina does in the run game this year. And if they're able to run the football efficiently, it only makes Lenore Sellers' job easier as a passer.
Yeah, totally agree. And Chris, I'm sure you can certainly add on to that one, something the Gamecocks have improved on since last year that people should be excited about. What do you think?
Yeah, I think Jack hit on it, talking about some of those positions. But if you had to boil it down to one word, it's probably just depth, right? Whether it's Shane Beamer's even said, hey, we're deeper at quarterback this year, when you consider the guys they've got in that room. But you can go up and down this roster, and I'll spare everybody from actually doing that. But position by position, they're deeper probably at every room. You don't have quite the star power yet of the quarterback position. You don't have a first round proven guy in Xavier Leggett, which he wasn't even proven going into last year. But at the other spots, for the most part, you have more depth from top to bottom. And that's something that we saw the defense get worn down at times in games last year. Shane Beamer would go to the podium after games and say, hey, our defense got worn down. And that outlook is better. Running back, you've got more depth in that room. There's a bunch of different rooms, even where there's still a little bit of a hint of unproven. You feel like, hey, there are more options there this year. So I'd just sum it up by saying more depth in 2024 than in 2023.
We're all about the positive vibes here. Wes, the king of positive vibes. How can you add on to that one and let us know what you think might be a little better this year?
Well, I was going to go running game. Jack said that. I was going to go depth. Chris said that. So let me say speed and athleticism at linebacker and get very specific. And I think, again, we're not – I set the rules that we're not talking about ODU, but I do think that will already be on display at Williams-Brice this weekend because ODU is going to spread you out. They're going to try to make your linebackers run sideline to sideline. And I think watching those guys run, Debo, Demetrius Knight, Bam Martin-Scott, we'll see if some of the other guys, Bengali Kamara, J.R. Johnson, see what their roles are. But particularly Demetrius Knight, a guy who can run fast, athletic. I think he's someone we're maybe not talking about enough for his role in this defense. And so I just think they're much faster, and that will hopefully be on display this weekend.
I want to talk about the newcomers here a little bit. Some new faces on the team this year. Certainly a lot to be excited about. We'll kind of make this one quick so we can get into our final season predictions after this. But just around the table really quickly, who are you most excited about / interested in when it comes to newcomers this year, Wes?
Give me real quick, Vandrevius Jacobs, transfer from Florida State. He's quickly moved up that depth chart. And to me, that means something even faster than some of the guys who were here in the spring. So very excited, not just because he's an overnight social media sensation for reasons I still haven't figured out. Give me Dre Jacobs for football reasons as well.
All right, Chris, what do you think?
I'll give you a bonus, one offense, one defense. So just most curious to see, Rocket Sanders. I think he's the most impactful newcomer on the offense, but also most curious to see him. Defensively, I actually have my most impactful newcomer as Kyle Kennard, the fifth-year transfer from Georgia Tech at edge. But I'm most anxious to see Dylan Stewart as a newcomer. So kind of cheated there a little bit, but wanted to make sure I shoehorned all those guys in there.
You get extra credit for that
Thank
one.
you.
Jack, can you add a couple of bonuses to yours?
Yeah, so I am actually going to go with a few guys here. Offensive line, assuming this is what the rotation looks like. Let's say it's Josiah Thompson at left tackle. That's a newcomer right there. Highly touted freshman from South Carolina. Big name at left tackle. I think left tackle is one of the more important spots on the offensive line. You really got to be able to protect Lenore Sellers. It starts with a guy like him. And then in the middle, you have Kamar Bell and Torselli Simpkins III at the guard spots. And I think those two guys right there, can really be nice veteran pieces on your interior of the offensive line and just the offensive line in general. You got Vershawn Lee, Kaysen Henry back as well. So I think the offensive line, I'm liking the newcomers they brought in mixed with the older guys. But I will say from a defensive perspective, one guy that I don't think is going to be starting much right now, but eventually will morph himself into a big role this year is, how can you not talk about him, Dylan Stewart on the edge. I think he brings a lot of hype, a big dynamic. A lot of people are saying that he's going to rack up a lot of sacks this season. I believe it. There's a great deal of speed and ferocity that this guy plays with at that edge spot that could be really lethal in what's already a pretty good room. You got Kyle Kennard in there, Gilbert Edmond, Brian Thomas, guys like that. But let's not sleep on a guy like Dylan Stewart that's going to make an impact, not just this year, but for years to come. And so I think he's definitely someone that I'm ready to see if the hype will, if he lives up to the hype.
Yeah, something Chris mentioned just a couple of minutes ago, certainly the depth of this team. But before we go any further in the show, Wes, the spotlight is on you. We've got a new sponsor that we want to shout out.
Yeah, we want to welcome Prize Picks to the show here. Prize Picks is the largest independently owned daily fantasy sports platform in all of North America. They're the easiest, most exciting way to play DFS. It's just you against the numbers. Instead of battling thousands of other players, including pros and sharks, you pick more than or less than on 2 to 6 player stat projections, and then, of course, watch the winnings roll in. Prize Picks has quick withdrawals, easy gameplay, and an enormous selection of players and stat types. It's what makes Prize Picks the #1 daily fantasy sports app. And, guys, it's got MLB, it's got NFL, it's got college football. Right now, if you went on there to Prize Picks, you could project more or less for rushing yards for Rocket Sanders, and it is just under 69.5 right now is their projection for Rocket Sanders rushing total this week against ODU. Just go to prizepicks.com or download the Prize Picks app and use the code GC. That's for Gamecock Central, of course. Use code GC to receive a guaranteed $50 once you play $5 in lineups. Once again, guys, we want to welcome Prize Picks. They've been a sponsor on some other On 3 podcasts. They're brand new for us. We want to welcome them to the GC Live family.
Wes, Jack, your face right there was honestly priceless. I have to say, Wes is like navigating who is on the screen, who's on the big screen. I've noticed that you've barely put yourself up as the main person. He keeps putting everybody else on the screen, like big and bold, and then Wes doesn't do it for himself. So officially called out as I
have the power.
With myself on the screen, just staring. But just a couple of questions left. Of course, I always come up with more because there's always so much more to say, and I haven't been on the show in such a long time. Chris is staring off into the abyss. He's like, please let this end right now. I'm tired of her talking.
Hey, I can put Chris up there like this. If we want.
Yeah, we'll just make him sit there. Anyways, couple more before we get out of here and finish Friday and get ready for game day. But want to talk about realistic expectations for this team, just kind of set them here before we get into the season officially tomorrow. What should fans realistically expect, Jack, from the Gamecocks? Obviously, things could change. Upsets may or may not happen. But from where you're at right now, from what you've seen, what should fans realistically expect out of South Carolina in 2024?
Oof. Well, that's a loaded question, I guess. Realistically, from just a general standpoint, I would say don't expect 15-0. I've seen people commenting that, telling me South Carolina is going to go 15. Like, look, I get it. I'll share my prediction when we get to that. But, I get why the Gamecock fan out there would think this team is going to be, unbeaten this year. Great. There's been so many good things said about this team. So I get it. You got to keep your expectations semi-realistic, though. This was a team last year that, as we know, struggled a great deal. But I think they are going to get back to a bowl game this year. I think the next step forward is definitely going to be up. And look, a game like tomorrow is a great test to see what you can do early in the year. We've talked about a bunch of guys. This isn't your Eastern Illinois cupcake type of game from year one of Shane Beamer. This is more like a Georgia State from year two, where you're playing it's a Sun Belt team. The Sun Belt is a conference where, you had Marshall beating Notre Dame a few years ago. You had South Alabama go into Stillwater last year and kill Oklahoma State. Old Dominion's beaten Virginia Tech twice since 2018. So there's been a lot of upsets from that conference over the years. So this is a team that, Old Dominion, they could come in here and make some noise. It wouldn't surprise me if this game is close in the first half, but I think eventually South Carolina's depth, talent, and just overall skill set is going to be too much. And so I think you're going to have some games this year where it's going to be closer than you might think. But I think this team, because of their defense and stuff and what they can potentially do running the football, can eat up some minutes and potentially win some games. So I think keep your expectations realistic as you can. But, 15-0, you never know. It could happen, I guess.
Never say never. That's what they say. But definitely a tough schedule for South Carolina, and that's not new news to anyone that's followed the Gamecocks. Always very difficult when you're in the SEC, and South Carolina's draw this year will not be an easy one. So, Chris, realistic expectations. Let's hear it.
Yeah, I think people have generally done a pretty good job in the Gamecock fan base of not saying, all right, last season was 5-7. Now you need to be in Atlanta this year, right? I think everybody recognizes the difficulty of what lies ahead with this schedule. We were talking to John Bryce of Football Scoop the other day, who covers things nationally on our radio show. And he doesn't think anybody in the SEC, as many great teams as there are, can run the table in the SEC, right? So it's just, even teams like Texas, Ole Miss, Missouri, Georgia, Bama, like the top 4, 5, 6 teams in the league are probably going to have to take some losses this year. So yes, South Carolina is looking to rebound. Yes, they're going to have to do it against a really difficult schedule. I think what's fair for this team is to expect them get back to postseason play. To do that, honestly, as it sits right here, they're probably going to have to score an upset or two. We'll see how everything looks, after a little bit of game action in 2024. But that's what it looks like right now. So I think it's realistic to expect, if you expect, hey, go make a bowl, get back to bowl eligibility, play in postseason, then that's fair. But it's still going to be tough to get there week to week.
Yeah, the disappointment of not making it to a bowl game last year certainly still stings, Wes. So can you provide a little bit of commentary on that and maybe give the fans some hope that a realistic expectation would be a bowl game for South Carolina?
We're not giving our final predictions yet, right?
Not yet. Almost.
Okay.
That's next.
Almost. I think the fact that you are probably going to have an improved rushing attack should make you feel pretty good. And I think the schedule, we still don't know. Like, yeah, on paper, it's very difficult. There will be a couple teams on there that are maybe better than we expect, but there's always a couple of teams that are worse than we expect. There will be a couple of teams that maybe have more injuries than they want. There'll be a couple teams that sort of have some bad losses early on and maybe, I don't want to say give up, but they have locker room issues. So I think it's very hard to predict a schedule when you start talking about 2 months from now. What are these teams going to look like? So I think for South Carolina, if they can start somewhat fast, and of course, to me, you got to circle that Kentucky game. We've circled that game the last few years, and this year it's the second game of the year. It's on the road. It'll be Sellers' first SEC start. To me, if you can win that game, then you're off to the races, because then you welcome in LSU to Williams-Brice Stadium. You'll have a 2-0 start, you would expect. You'll have a jam-packed Willie B, a fired-up fan base. I think after what happened last year, this fan base needs a little bit of hope. They need something to pull for. So to me, that means getting off to a pretty good start this year.
All right, almost at the end of our show here, the moment we have all been waiting for, final record predictions for the year. Clearly a little bit harder to do this at the beginning, as Wes just mentioned, when you don't quite know what things are going to look like in October or November from an injury standpoint, whether that be for South Carolina or the teams that they're facing. But as things stand right now, final record predictions for 2024. Jack Veltri, what are you thinking on this one?
Yeah, so I was not going to do the story this morning, honestly, because I wrote a prediction story. I'm like, I don't see many other people doing it. I don't want to be like the only one out there that puts my straight up predictions and then it comes back to bite me or whatever. All right, so straight up, I picked South Carolina to go 8-4 this year. If you want to read more about why I picked South Carolina to go 8-4, go ahead and read that story. That would be cool. But I do think, the
shameless plug.
Yes, the Cliff Notes version of it is the fact that, look, I do think September could either be a month where you go, and I'm including the Old Dominion game in there because let's be real, it's basically September at this point. You could either honestly start out 4-0, or you could start out 2-2. I really think there's no in between. You could either lose those first 2 SEC games, or you'll win them both, and you're off to the races heading into a bye week and then Ole Miss. However, I do think South Carolina probably does get off to that, 3-1 start. They probably drop one of those SEC games. And then, that month of October is really tough because you got the Juice Wells game with Ole Miss. But I think Ole Miss is a really good team. You got Bama, Oklahoma. The one upset I will share is that I do have South Carolina beating Oklahoma. I just think coming off the hype of the Red River rivalry, all that comes with that game. You have so much adrenaline going into it. And then, if you win, you're maybe a little hungover from that week going into South Carolina or going to play South Carolina the next week. So I think the Gamecocks would probably win that game as an upset. They're going to need an upset somewhere along the way to get to 6 wins or more. And then end of the year, I've kept going back and forth on it. I could totally see this team finishing 6-6 or 7-5, but I do think at the end of the year they can find a way to beat Clemson. I've said it over and over again. I think eventually not using the transfer portal and NIL the way it should be used in this day and age is going to come back to bite Dabo Swinney and Clemson. Not saying it'll be this year, but I think eventually there are going to be teams that leapfrog them. And I do think South Carolina, if they did it 2 years ago going into Clemson and winning a stunner the week after that Tennessee game, what's to say they can't go do it again? So I definitely think 8-4 is in the cards this year. But again, I think 6 wins at the minimum is where I could see it. Maybe ceiling 9 wins, but 8-4 is where I have them.
8-4. I think that people are going to like that.
Yeah, I think so.
8-4.
That was the short version, Jack?
Yeah.
It's more detailed. It's more detailed in the story. So.
Remember, go to GamecockCentral.com right now. Actually, not right now. Wait about 5 minutes and then go to GamecockCentral.com and then read Jack's story. Don't forget it. Wes Mitchell, are you predicting 8-4 for South Carolina?
I am not. I thought I was being kind of positive with what I was saying, but Jack out positive.
Jack is now the king of positivity.
Yeah. So by the way, kickoff 24 promotional code on Gamecock Central. Come sign up, 50% off. That would be good until end of day today on Friday. Guys, I got 7-5. I was back and forth between 6-6 and 7-5. I feel like Carolina had a lot of bad luck last year. Maybe it evens out for them a little bit this year. Realistically, 6-6, a little bit of that luck, 7-5. I feel like this is the reverse of last year. There were signs internally that maybe there were reasons to worry, but the national hype train was kind of still going based on what they had done, the previous year. Tennessee, Clemson, close bowl game against Notre Dame. There obviously are still things, there's still questions that have to be answered, but that's with every team in America right now, I think. So give me 7-5, but I do think you really got to beat Kentucky to get that thing going.
Chris, the question now is, do you agree with either Jack or Wes, or are you going with something different?
Yeah, I actually do have the same pick as Wes after thinking about it. So I've got 7-5 as well. Again, just a tough path. I was thinking about it, 16 teams in the SEC this year. Realistically, I think 14 of them are probably going to be either as good or better, and most better on paper than last year. But when you have that many teams in a league, in a really strong league, and that many teams have improved their rosters year over year, that means, it goes back to what Wes said earlier, somebody's getting left out and somebody's going to be disappointed, right? So a lot of teams that we still don't know a lot about. I think there's a few mystery teams in the league. South Carolina is one. I don't think anybody's going to be accused of overhyping South Carolina this year. But I also think a lot of people in the national media and just kind of around college football are looking at the Gamecocks and saying, well, they went 7-5, or they went 5-7 last year, and they lost their 2 best players on offense. Why would they be any better this year? But when you really dive in to what they've added in the portal, what happened last year with injuries and some of the other things, scheme changes, I do think there's a path there for South Carolina to go 7-5 or better. They got to stay healthy. I agree with y'all. They got to make some headway in the month of September in the first part of the season. It is going to be tough to get there. I don't think it's an easy 7-5 by any means, but I do think they can get there.
I like it. Everybody has South Carolina going to a bowl game, so that is good stuff. And we are very much looking forward to the season. It is starting tomorrow. It is hard to believe that it is already here, but talking season is officially over, and it is time to play some football, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to all of you, Jack, Chris, and Wes, for letting me come back and host the show. Hopefully I can be with you a little bit more throughout football season. Was gone for a little bit there, still here in Charlotte, as you can see behind me, but looking forward to keeping up and seeing all of the exciting things that you guys talk about and write about on Gamecock Central throughout the season. So for Wes Mitchell, Jack Veltri, and Chris Clark, I am Kendall Smith. Thank you guys so much for joining us here on JC Live. Plenty more coming on GamecockCentral.com, so be sure to check us out there. Follow us on social media. Happy game day eve, everybody. Football is coming back. It'll be here tomorrow. Sleep well, have a good night, and get ready for the season.